The Constant Heart by Dilly Court. Read by Annie Aldington. Chapter 1. London, May, 1874. The small patch of sky just visible between the sooty clouds was the same shade of blue as the forget-me-nots and ribbons on her new bonnet, a birthday present from her father. Smiling happily, Rosina stepped onto the pavement outside the milliner's shop. She was 18 today, and life was wonderful. In her world, the sun was always shining. She did not see the squalor, vice and poverty lurking in every dark corner of the Ratcliffe Highway, the East End's most notorious street, where even the police were afraid to go after dark. She barely noticed the crush of horse-drawn vehicles, with the drivers bellowing insults at each other. To her ears, the raucous cries of the costermongers, bootblacks, match-sellers, and hot chestnut vendors, all vying for trade, were as musical as the wheezing notes played by the hurdy-gurdy men. She picked up her long skirts to prevent them from trailing on the filthy cobblestones, carpeted with horse dung, dog excrement, rotten fruit and mouldy straw. She was oblivious to the stench of steaming sewers and the sulphurous fumes from the river. She was so accustomed to seeing the slatterns hanging round in shop doorways, touting for trade, and the ragged, pock-marked faces of the street urchins begging for money, that she barely noticed them. She stopped to look in a shop window, where exotic seashells, shimmering and iridescent, lay on a bed of white sand. Her reflection smiled back at her, and she paused for a moment, primping and admiring her beautiful bonnet. A voice from within called her name, and Rosina poked her head round the open door. "Good morning, Mrs. Sanchez. Isn't it a lovely day?" "Happy birthday, Rosie." Mrs. Sanchez heaved her large body from the stool behind the counter and waddled to the door. "Hold your hand out, ducks." She took a necklace of pink-lipped shells from the window display and tucked it over Rosina's outstretched fingers. "Thank you. It's really, really lovely." Rosina kissed her on the cheek. Mrs. Sanchez wheezed a gale of garlic into Rosina's face. "It's not nearly as lovely as you, my pet. You're just like your dear mother, God rest her soul." Rosina knew that this was a compliment. It seemed that everyone had adored her mother. "I wish I'd known her." "She was a real lady. A beautiful woman, Rosie. Too good for this earth." Mrs. Sanchez rubbed her hand across her eyes, and her full lips wobbled. "Look at me, silly old fool, making you sad on your birthday." Rosina grasped her work-worn hand and gave it a squeeze. "Nothing can make me sad today, Mrs. Sanchez. Papa should be home on the tide, and we're having a special supper. I'll wear my lovely present tonight." She slipped the shell necklace into her reticule. "Goodbye, dearie. Give my best regards to your daddy." Mrs. Sanchez disappeared into the dark interior of the shop, with her stays creaking like the timbers of an old sailing barge. Rosina blew her a kiss and walked on. A small child, covered in bleeding sores, sidled up to her, holding out its hand. It was impossible to tell whether it was a boy or a girl, but the eyes were those of an old person, huge and beseeching in the pinched face. Rosina pulled out her purse and placed 2 pennies in the outstretched hand. Claw-like fingers closed over the coins, and the child was gone, disappearing into the gaping mouth of a dark alley. Rosina sighed, and a shiver ran down her spine. She had chosen to put it out of her mind, but she knew only too well that poverty marched alongside wealth in the great city of London. Misfortune, disease and death could strike anyone at any time. She walked on. She would not think about that now, and she would not be unhappy today. The month was May, her favourite time of the year, when the late spring sunshine warmed the cold pavements of East London and banished the pea-soup of fogs into a dim memory.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?